So you've been thinking about this whole quiet quitting thing, huh? And like not just the doing the bare minimum part of it, but all the like bigger questions it brings up, you know, about labor and faith and what we owe a boss versus what we owe ourselves. It's like
Hmm.
deep stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
We've got a quite a stack of your sources here, actually. Articles, economic theories, even some Bible verses. So today, let's see if we can't like untangle all this together.
Sounds good. What I think is really interesting is how this whole idea of quiet quitting, it kind of gets at this tension between, what we're told we should care about at work, like going above and beyond, being loyal to the company,
Right.
versus what a lot of people are actually experiencing in their workplaces. You know what I mean?
It's like this disconnect. Yeah. And then bringing faith into it just adds this whole other layer on top of it all.
Absolutely.
To kick things off, you flagged this marginal productivity theory. Lay that on me. What's that all about?
Okay, so imagine a workplace, but it's like a machine, right? Labor goes in, products and services come out.
Okay.
Marginal productivity, it's all about measuring how much each extra bit of labor, each hour you work, how much that increases the output. And then theoretically anyway, how much extra revenue that makes for the company.
Okay, so far so good, but there's a catch, right?
Well, yeah. Since like the 1970s, something really interesting happened. Worker productivity in the US, it keeps going up, right? We're making more, doing more than ever before. But real wages, what your paycheck actually buys you, that hasn't kept pace at all.
So wait, people are working harder, producing more, but they're not getting ahead. Doesn't seem fair.
That's the heart of the issue, and this isn't just some theory, this is real. The Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that the data from 2022 just shows this widening gap between productivity and how much people are actually compensated. And this is something economists, people like Salvatore, have been saying for years.
Hmm?
They point to things like globalization, fewer people joining unions, that kind of thing.
Hold on, let's unpack that a bit. Globalization. Okay, companies taking jobs overseas for cheaper labor. But how does the decline of unions fit into that?
Well, historically, unions gave workers a lot more power to negotiate, right? Strength in numbers and all that. You've got a collective voice. You can bargain for better pay, better conditions. Fewer union members, that power kind of fades away.
Which brings us back to quiet quitting, right?
Exactly.
Because if you feel like you're putting in more effort than you're getting back, why wouldn't you disengage, you know?
And disengagement might be putting it mildly, honestly.
Yeah.
Gallup did this study, and it suggests something crazy, like 50% or more of workers in the U.S. might be quiet quitting in some form.
Wow, 50%. That's wild. But before we go any further, let's make sure we're on the same page about what quiet quitting actually means. We're not talking about literally quitting your job.
Right. It's more nuanced. Think of it like a spectrum of being checked out. On one side, you have people who do their job description, and that's it. No more, no less, no late nights, no going above and beyond.
Right.
And then on the other end, you have folks who are like actively looking for something else, but they haven't made the jump yet.
Okay, so less about like dramatically storming out the door and more about gradually pulling back, being less enthusiastic, less willing to give that extra effort.
Exactly. And there's no one reason why people do it either. Some, as Herway says, they're just reacting to a bad workplace, They feel disrespected, not valued.
Yeah.
And others, like Manning suggests, are just plain burned out,
Yeah.
no engagement from their employer.
Yeah.
And then there's just, the classic bad boss, like Darty talks about.
Unless who wants to go the extra mile for a boss who doesn't even appreciate them?
Right.
But this is where it gets really interesting to me, because couldn't you say that quiet quitting is like a totally logical reaction to this gap we're talking about? Like, if you don't feel like your work is rewarded fairly, isn't it just basic economic supply and demand?
It's an interesting argument. Think about it. If the demand for skilled workers stays high, but the supply of people willing to bend over backwards for like no extra reward,
Right.
that supply drops, then those workers, well, they've got a bit more power all of a sudden.
Interesting. So they've got leverage now.
Exactly. Remember the U.S. Chamber of Commerce report? Huge worker shortage, 4.3 million unfilled jobs last year.
Wow.
When there just aren't as many workers and those workers know what they're worth, well, they're in a much stronger position to push back against unfair treatment, even if it's just through this quiet quitting thing.
Interesting. So we've got all this economic pressure, right?
Yeah.
Workers feeling squeezed. Companies can't find enough people. Well, recipe for tension, for sure. But then you add in the ethical stuff, like, is it even right to kind of check out at work, even if you feel undervalued? Things get kind of murky.
It gets complicated. It's not just about money anymore. It's about your values, integrity, all that. And for a lot of people of faith, that means looking for answers in Scripture.
Yeah, totally. Can't talk about work ethic without uh, digging into some of those biblical principles. You had some verses about fair pay flagged. What were those again?
Oh, yeah. One that always comes up is from the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 25.4, I think. It talks about not muzzling an ox while it's threshing grain.
Okay, at first glance, a little specific. What's the deeper meaning there?
It's actually a really powerful analogy. The idea is this animal is working, right? Threshing that grain. Well, it deserves to eat some of that grain. You shouldn't stop it from, like, enjoying the result of all that work.
So this idea that you work, you deserve to benefit.
Exactly. A just reward for your labor. And this wasn't just some, random Old Testament thing. Jesus says basically the same thing in Luke 10.7. The worker deserves his wages.
It's crazy how these ideas from, like, thousands of years ago still totally apply today.
They do, right. And it's not just a one-time thing either. Paul talks about this in a few of his letters, too. In 1 Timothy, he quotes that same verse about the ox, and in Colossians, he's straight up telling employers, give your people what's just, what's fair. This clearly mattered a lot to those early Christians.
Makes you wonder what they'd think of the modern workplace, huh?
Yeah.
But I think there's, like, an even deeper layer here, too. It's not just about getting the right paycheck. It's something more,
And more inherent. Totally agree. And that's what's so cool about the biblical view. It goes beyond just like transactions. And it talks about the fact that every single person has dignity. Every person has worth.
I like that you say cool, because it really is. Like, in a world that's obsessed with what you produce, how much you do, it's easy to forget that, right? Our worth goes way beyond all that.
Totally. And the Bible reminds us about that over and over. Think about John 3.16, probably one of the most famous verses in there. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. Yeah, it's like burned into my memory from childhood. Exactly. And think about what it's actually saying. Every single person, you, me, everyone listening right now, we're all valuable enough for that kind of sacrifice, And it's not just about like avoiding some punishment either. In Luke, there's this whole thing about how much joy there is in heaven over just one sinner who repents.
So there's this huge value placed on every person that has nothing to do with money or how much you get done in a day.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole thing about like how much your labor is worth so interesting. Because if we're made in God's image, if we really have inherent worth, well, maybe our value at work shouldn't just be about how much profit we create.
It's like that saying, you can't put a price tag on a human soul, which, okay, sounds pretty dramatic, but it kind of gets at what you're saying.
It does. It is kind of dramatic, isn't it? But I think that's part of what gets lost in all this talk about work.
Yeah.
We get so focused on the numbers, on the bottom line, that we forget about the people involved.
It's like we're trying to, like, fit a square peg in a round hole or something, trying to make human value fit into an economic equation. And of course, it doesn't quite work, right? So, okay, let's say we buy into this idea. Our worth isn't about how much money we make. Then what? Like, what are we actually supposed to do with that day to day? Should we just like shrug off unfair treatment and wait for, I don't know, bonus in heaven or something?
No, not at all. It's not about being passive. Even though the Bible talks about that radical worth humans have, it also doesn't shy away from hard work at all. Paul in Colossians, actually, Colossians 3.2, 3, 2, 4, he says we should work wholeheartedly, like we're working for the Lord, not just a boss.
Wow, that's a totally different way to think about it. So it's not that, like, earthly rewards don't matter, but they're not like the ultimate goal.
Exactly. It changes your whole perspective. You still show up, you still aim for excellence, but you're not just doing it for the promotion or whatever. There's a deeper reason.
This reminds me of what Jesus said in Matthew about storing up treasures in heaven. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Yes, that's it. It's about like aligning yourself with a totally different system of rewards, one that goes way beyond whatever is happening at work.
That is powerful. But let's be real, it's easy to get sucked into that whole rat race mentality, especially with everything we talked about, the pressure on workers these days. So how do you actually live that out? Like practically, when the whole culture around you seems to care more about profits than people.
It's tough, no doubt. But here's a thought. What if, instead of quiet quitting, we tried, like, quiet innovation?
Quiet innovation. I like the sound of that already.
So we talked about how messed up the system can be, how it can make people feel so undervalued. And yeah, one way to react is to just check out, do the bare minimum. But what if we saw it as an opportunity instead? Like, what if instead of quietly quitting, we quietly excelled? We found these creative ways to up our own game, make a difference right where we are.
So instead of disengaging, you're saying like almost re-engage, but on your own terms. Not because you're loyal to the company, but because you want to use your talents, your gifts in a way that matters.
Yes, exactly. And think about what that could do. That article you shared, it said something like, most big innovation projects in companies, they fail.
Yeah, it was something crazy, like 80% failure rate, I think Salvatore said.
Right, 80%. So, of course, companies are afraid to try new stuff. But for us as individuals, there's way less risk, you know? We can experiment, be creative, and who knows, maybe that little act of quiet innovation, that striving for excellence, even when it's hard, maybe it sparks something bigger. Maybe it inspires other people or even changes the whole company for the better, little by little.
Love that. So, to everyone listening, that's something to think about. In a world obsessed with how much you do, how much you make, where does your worth really lie? We've looked at the economics, the faith side of things, even this idea of quiet innovation. Now it's your turn to take the deep